The United States Special Iran Envoy is heading back to Europe to work on reviving the Iran nuclear deal. But in the meantime, the curtain has been pulled back on just how Iranian foreign policy works. An extraordinary and frank 3-hour recording with the foreign minister and chief nuclear negotiator Javad Zarif has been leaked, in which he criticizes Iran's Revolutionary Guards for undermining the country's diplomatic efforts. He even calls out national hero and assassinated general Qasem Soleimani, and Russia as well, saying all were trying to sabotage the nuclear deal. There's fallout in the United States for chief negotiator, the former Secretary of State John Kerry, after Zarif asserted that he had told him of Israeli airstrikes against Iranian positions in Syria. Kerry denies any such conversation ever took place. Joining me on this is Karim Sadjadpour, an Iran analyst and senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. Welcome to the program, Karim Sadjadpour. Why do you think this was leaked, and why does it matter?
It's tough to say why it was leaked, Christian. I assume it was enemies of Foreign Minister Zarif who leaked the tape because they don't want to see a future for him in Iranian politics. I don't think that he himself leaked it. Why it matters, it essentially reveals something that you and I have known for a long time, which is that there are essentially two parallel regimes working in concert in Iran. You have a deep state led by the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards, and these are the forces that build Iran's clandestine nuclear facilities. They cultivate regional militias, they support Hezbollah, they oppose Israel. They're the forces that crush internal dissent within Iran. They take hostages. In some cases, they conduct assassinations. And you have another parallel state in Iran, which is led by President Hassan Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif. And they essentially have very little power, but they have accountability. And I think one of the things that Zarif was talking about in this interview is the fact that he is someone who has essentially been powerless. The power in Iran belongs to the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards. And after 8 years of essentially absorbing accountability for all that goes wrong in Iran, I think he was trying to reveal something that we all knew, which is accountability belongs elsewhere.
So this is what he said to that end about Qasem Soleimani, which, as you know, better than many of us, was kind of a revered figure in Iran. But he belongs to that deep state military industrial complex that you were just talking about. This is the conversation between Zarif and the interviewer, who is the Iranian economist Saeed Leilaz.
خب من و سردار سلیمانی اون سوی دولت واقعا بله من و سردار سلیمانی الزاما هم نظر نبودیم در همه چیز، اما احساس می‌کردیم که باید خدا رحمتش کنه، احساس می‌کردیم که ما موظفیم که با هم هماهنگ باشیم و این کارو می‌کردیم. و من اینو میتونم به جرئت بگم، من دیپلماسی رو بیشتر هزینه کردم برای میدان تا میدان برای دیپلماسی هزینه شده باشه.
So, Karim, as you said, it kind of confirms the nature of the Iranian regime. But what do you think practically it means about, for instance, let's just take the thing that the United States and Europe is very involved in right now, wanting to get back to a nuclear arms control agreement, so to speak, with Iran?
You know, Christian, I don't think this really changes minds in Washington or even Europe per se, and that I think people in Washington have long known that Zarif is really a messenger, not someone who makes policy in Iran. Now, during the Obama years, there was a hope that if we do the nuclear deal with Iran, it could empower these more moderate forces within Iran, like President Rouhani, like Foreign Minister Zarif, and it could transform Iran internally and transform U.S.-Iran relations. I don't think that the Biden administration has that same kind of hope. They want to revive the nuclear deal with Iran for American security reasons, not necessarily because they believe it's going to bring about a transformation in Iran or transform U.S.-Iran relations. And I suspect the Europeans the same. But as I was listening, and I listened to the full 3-hour interview in Persian, Christian, and as I was listening to it, and this clip that you just played about Zarif talking about the assassinated General Qasem Soleimani, it struck me the whole time that Zarif was describing his job as somewhere between like a janitor and a firefighter, and that he was essentially tasked with cleaning up the mess of the Revolutionary Guards and bringing the country out of crisis. And he was told at times to tweet things and say things which he knew to be dishonest. And, you know, he was in a very difficult position these last 8 years, and I think he now wants to come clean, perhaps, on some of these issues.
This was sort of, I guess, labeled as a series of interviews with the outgoing ministers for historical reasons. That's how the interviewer labeled these. And certainly he had a long conversation with Zarif. Were you surprised, as others have been, in the revelation by Zarif about Russia not necessarily, you know, playing good cop in the Iran nuclear negotiations or with the deal, kind of saying that Russia was quite happy to see it sabotage? Let me just play this little excerpt on Russia and Soleimani.
ما افتاده یه مرور بکن. فقط کافیه مرور بکن. آخرینش حمله به سفارت سعودی و گرفتن 2 کشتی آمریکایی بود، ولی اولینش اونا نبود. اولینش سفر سردار سلیمانی به مسکو بود.
اون سفر تحت کنترل شما نبود؟
خیر. اون سفر به اراده روسیه شکل گرفت.
خب به اراده روسیه نباید از طریق وزارت خارجه به سردار
وقتی که اراده روسیه بر این است که دستاورد وزارت خارجه رو نابود بکنه، حتما از طریق وزارت خارجه عمل نمی‌کنه.
دکتر حرف بسیار سنگینی میزنه.
حرف بسیار سنگینی میزنه.
So Russia is involved, along with China and the Europeans, in getting that nuclear deal, you know, back together again. What do you think Russia's game is in this?
Christian, there is a widespread belief within Iran, and frankly, I to some extent share this view, that Russia benefits from an isolated Iran. Russia doesn't want to see Iran emerge from its 42-year isolation for a variety of reasons. Number one is that right now, after Russia, Iran is very competitive with Russia in terms of its reserves of natural gas. But Iran, by virtue of the fact that it's isolated, it's under sanctions, it hasn't exploited its vast gas reserves. So it's not really competing with Russia. Number two is that as long as Iran is isolated, Iran is very dependent on Russia strategically. So Russia doesn't want to see a U.S.-Iran rapprochement because they know that Iran would be far less interested in cultivating its relationship with Russia as it would the United States. And lastly, in some ways, Russia likes the fact that Iran is a thorn in the side of the United States. Now, all that said, I haven't seen the evidence that suggests, as Zarif alluded to, that Russia has been actively trying to undermine the nuclear agreement. I think that Russia, by and large, has supported both the original JCPOA and its revival. But I do agree with Zarif that Russia doesn't benefit from an Iran which has emerged from isolation or a U.S.-Iran rapprochement.